I'm sorry that the heat is not really at its optimum tonight, but that's the way it was in Krakow. Last week I spoke to you about the situation of the Jews in Vilna in the 18th century. The enormous disputes that consumed the community, and the disputes that continued then into the 19th and 20th and even into the 21st centuries, disputes that have not gone away from us. Disputes regarding the rabbinate and disputes regarding Chassidus and the disputes regarding Haskalah and the problems of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish feeling. Now, Krakow is a little different. And in order for us to really appreciate what happened in the 18th century, we have to begin earlier. What happened with the Jews, the general history of the Jews in Krakow. Krakow was the capital of Poland in medieval times. There was no Warsaw. And Krakow was a university town. It was a town of intellectual prowess. You're talking about the time of Jan Hus, and you're talking about the time of Copernicus. People that stood against the church. People that opened up new vistas in the ideas of how to view the universe and how to view mankind. And therefore, Jews enjoyed a great deal of hospitality in the first few hundred years in Poland, certainly in the first few hundred years in Krakow. Krakow was a city on the Oistral River. It was a major trading city. It was Galicia. It had bonds with Ukraine. Traded north and south and east and west, and the Jews found themselves in a very comfortable situation. And they were invited there by the Polish kings, and the Polish kings are the ones that protected them, were very friendly to them, gave them special privileges. The most friendly king was a king by the name of Casimir in the late 1400s. And he had the advantage of having a Jewish mistress, and that somehow also had an effect upon him. If he would have had a Jewish wife, I don't know what his relationship would have been, but a Jewish mistress certainly made him more amenable towards the Jews, and many of the favorable laws and exemptions all were from this king. And they continued. So the 15th century, the 16th century, even the 17th century are good times for the Jews in Poland and good time for the Jews in Krakow. Now, the Jewish population in Krakow was always between 20 to 30% of the city. So when the city was a small city, it was a small Jewish population. The city became a larger city. In 1900, there were 68,000 Jews there. And before the war, there were many, many more thousands. The Jews always comprised a large section of the community in Krakow. And as I mentioned, Krakow was a university town. Now, the enemies of the Jews in Krakow were A, the students in the university, and B, the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church opposed the policies of the kings, opposed the policies of granting any rights to the Jews, and we have records for their attitude here in the rabbinic response of the time, which I'll discuss with you in a moment. And we find, therefore, that the Jews built up a hostile relationship, both with the university and with the church. and eventually that would come back to haunt them. It would bring great problems to them. The Jews were, as I mentioned, mainly in money lending, in small commerce, traders. They were excluded from many bands of guilds, but nevertheless they found themselves, and compared to the Jews in Germany and compared to the Jews in Lithuania, they were wealthy, even though compared to probably other standards they were not to be considered wealthy, but they had a better life. And therefore, for instance, we find in the tshuva from the Maram Mintz, Moshe Mintz, who was a Polish rabbi who ended up in Italy. There was one of the strange things is that in the 15th and 16th centuries, all of the rabbis almost in Italy were Polish rabbis who emigrated. The Maram Padua and Maram Mintz, all were rabbis in Italy, even though they were Poles. And they immigrated simply because the rabbinic positions were more favorable and there was less competition for them, whereas in Poland at this time you have an enormous amount of scholars, tremendous amount of scholars, and when you have a tremendous amount of scholars in a relatively small place, it's very, very difficult for anyone to get a job or to get a meaningful job, and therefore the Polish rabbis traveled throughout the world. So here's what the Maram Mintz says regarding the church. Asher poga ha-komer gam biyoshvim tachas ha-melech Polin. Even though we dwelt under the protection of the Polish kings, the cardinals and the priests, they came and persecuted us. And therefore, he said, our good relations, the good situation that we were in, we were always in danger because the church was always out to revoke it. The church was always agitating against Jewish comfort, against the right of the Jews to live there. And part of the problem was the fact that this town kept on burning down. And the fires always started in the Jewish neighborhood. And from the Jewish neighborhood, since again you're talking about wooden homes and about thatched roofs and about a big wind, the town was just tinder. It burned down in a minute. And the church accused the Jews of purposely setting the fire in their neighborhood, because it always started in the Jewish neighborhood. And they purposely accused the Jews of burning down the town in order to destroy the Christian population. As nonsensical as that was, because the Jewish part was destroyed completely, and Jews were burned to death, nevertheless, the church's accusation did find a response in the non-Jewish population. Another thing that happened was that in Krakow, as in Europe generally, there were recurrent incidents of the plague over and over again. And for various reasons, the Jews were not as affected as the non-Jews. And therefore the church was able to say that the Jews were the ones that spread the bacillus, the Jews are the ones that caused the plague. So you have the problem that the Jews are causing the plague, and the Jews are burning down the town, and the Jews are making money, and the kings are favoring the Jews. All of this has to be kept in mind in order to understand the depths of anti-Semitism which Poland sank to, and which it is still afflicted by, even though there aren't that many Jews left. And it's because of the fact that you have this insidious 500-600 year indoctrination that every problem that Poland has is the Jews' problem. The Jews caused it. The Jews were protected by the kings, and the kings, in a great respect, were happy to persecute the church because they didn't want to share their power and they didn't want to share their wealth with the church, and they therefore you had this like a three-ring circus going on all the time: the kings, the Jews, and the church. Everybody's against everybody else. Everybody unites with someone in order to get the current enemy. And it's a very, very difficult situation, but the Jews prospered because of it. In the 1500s, you have the great flourishing of Krakow as a Talmudic center. Rabbi Moshe Isserlich, the Ramah. So the Ramah's father was a great merchant. And he received special permission from the Polish kings to operate his businesses all over Poland. Was a very, very wealthy man. And so you have, in this period of time, there were a number of very wealthy Jews. You have 5 major synagogues, not the Ramah Shul. The Ramah Shul is a small shul, was not the major synagogue, and had nothing to do with the Ramah. Just like the Rashi Chapel in Worms has nothing to do with Rashi. But people called it the Ramah Shul in honor of the Ramah. But the real Ramah Shul was built by his father, who built a magnificent edifice. And then there was something called the High Shul, and then there was something called the Pepper Shul by the people who were the spice merchants. And they built these enormous synagogues that rivaled the non-Jewish houses of worship. And they had a great deal of wealth. And the Ramah was a student of Rabbi Yaakov Polak, who was the Rav. So the question is, how do you pronounce in Hebrew that name? Many of them, the Germans pronounced it Falk or Falk, because nobody in Germany wanted to be called Polak. But in Poland, they pronounced it Polak because they wanted it that they should be identified as being Polish. And that's the name Polak, etc., that's common in the Jewish world. So Rabbi Yaakov Polak was really the great Rosh Yeshiva, and the Ramah was his major disciple and also his son-in-law. And the Ramah becomes a Rav in Krakow, and there were great Rabbonim that were Rabbonim in Krakow. The Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis was a Rav in Krakow, and the Shagas Aryeh was a Rav in Krakow. There were many great Rabbonim in Krakow, and the authority of the rabbinate was supreme. The rabbi could do anything. And because they had these great people as the Rabbonim, and the people were smart enough not to abuse their power, so you had really a harmonious situation for many centuries, all of which is going to break down in the 18th century. And it will break down, as I'll discuss, because of the coming of the new forces. Let's just look at the rules of the town in the 1600s, right before the 1700s. So we have a Pinkas, we have a record of the rules of the Jewish council in Krakow, which and it was agreed to by the Bach and by the Taz and the Taz's son. I think we'll find it very interesting. First of all, it is forbidden in Jewish elementary schools that there be more than 40 students in a class. So obviously there were classes that were more than 40 students, otherwise they wouldn't have to make a rule. And if you want to have 40, you have to have 2 assistant teachers. In other words, there had to be 3 teachers in the room at the time. I imagine just to hold them down, you needed that amount of teacher. You were not allowed to teach Talmud to more than 25 students at a time. That's a Gemara. The Talmud itself says that in Bava Basra that the limit in a classroom is 25. Of course, everyone picks and chooses what Gemara they want to follow. So today, My grandson is in a shiur that has 300 that are sitting, standing, etc. But that's older ones, so maybe the rule would be different there. All children must learn Polish. They must learn Hebrew. They must pass the exams in Hebrew grammar. They have to know past tense, future tense, present tense, yochid v'rabim, chaserim ukfulim, all the binyonim in Hebrew, a test that most of us would undoubtedly fail. But here you're talking 1600s. They have to study mathematics. The minimum in mathematics in elementary school is addition, subtraction, and multiplication. They also have to pass a test when they're 14 years old. Anyone who is 14 years old and was not deemed to be material for further Talmudic study goes to work. They had an apprentice system, so it weeded out 90%, maybe 95% of the student body. After 14, they're out in the labor market. And only those whom the rabbis felt showed real promise were allowed to continue and to study with the Rabbonim. And in order to obtain rabbinical ordination, smicha, the rabbi of the town had to approve the candidacy, and then the candidate had to pass the exams in the entire area of halakha with 3 impartial rabbis. In other words, the rabbi of the town couldn't decide, because the rabbi of the town is subject to political and family pressures, and maybe he'll like the guy and maybe he won't. So they had 3 impartial people that they imported that gave the exams, and that's how it worked in Krakow. Also, they had rules about how the citizens are supposed to behave. You're not allowed to throw garbage out the 2nd floor window. From the rules, you understand what was going on, because you don't have to make a rule otherwise. You're not allowed to, it's a very interesting rule, you're not allowed to participate in the Polish lottery. The rabbis forbade gambling, and they said the lottery is gambling, and they said the lottery only contributes to moral decadence, and it takes money away from the poor that they can't afford, because the great millionaires don't buy the lottery tickets. It's the poor guy that buys the lottery ticket because he thinks he's going to make 1,000,000 zlotys at one shot, and they don't have the money for it. So they said the Jews aren't allowed to participate in the lottery. Here in Israel, the lottery is sacrosanct. You're not allowed to buy any item from anyone under 20 years of age. That was to discourage children from stealing. So no one was allowed to buy from any item from people under 20 years of age. You're not allowed to buy anything that's being sold too cheaply. You know, the guy that wants to sell you a Rolex for $60. So one of 2 things: either it's not a Rolex, or it's a stolen watch. And therefore, and these rules were enforced because there was a Jewish police force in town. The rabbi is not allowed to put people into chayrim. He's not allowed to ban people without first informing the board of directors. Since the people he wanted to ban usually were on the board of directors, therefore that was a pretty strong veto against his powers. We also have a very good rule here that one was not allowed to were not allowed to wear fur coats, jewelry, or fancy clothes in public, both out of terms of modesty, but the real reason was because it incurred the enmity of the non-Jewish population. And since the women wanted to flaunt the fact that they had furs, or that they had jewelry, or that they had special finery, so therefore this was part of the rule that the rabbi said, that the town council said rather, that they should not do so. Because of that, there became like standard dress for women for Shabbat and Yom Tov. And what the standard dress is, I don't know. I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know yet. But there was an attempt to standardize dress, that it should not raise enmity, it should not cause jealousy, and also in society it should not cause rifts that were unnecessary. Now these rules of the council in the 1600s all were enforced. As I mentioned, there was a Jewish police force, and they were enforced, and there were also taxes that they collected, and because of the fact that they had favorable rulings and favorable opinions from the Polish kings, so the taxes were not onerous, whereas the taxes in Lithuania and in other parts of Europe were always oppressive taxes that the Jewish community could not meet. Because of that, you had the situation here I mentioned last week, that it was common practice in Lithuania for rabbis to purchase their rabbinic position. The town was broke, they owed a lot of money in taxes, and here some man came along and he said, I'm going to be the rabbi in your town. There are candidates. So it was not purely decided on merit. The candidate that said, I'll take care of half the debt, or I'll take care of all the debt, or I have a father-in-law that'll take care of all the debt, naturally gained priority, which was a very corrupting influence on the rabbinate and on the choice of rabbis. But in Poland, as late as the 1600s, that didn't exist, simply because of the fact that the Jewish community was not in debt. The taxes were not onerous, so therefore they didn't have to come on to these types of situations. And so you have almost an idyllic situation as we enter the 1700s. In the 1700s, the whole thing turns around. And that's why that's the wind of change here. That this is really the beginning of the downfall of Polish Jewry. If you look at it in a long-term perspective of history, so the Jews came to Poland in the late 1200s. So from the 1200s till the 1600s, the Jews are in good shape. It's 400 years of relative wealth, prosperity, freedom from persecution, all relative to what's going on in the rest of Europe. And that's why you had this tremendous immigration coming from the West, especially from Germany and other places, and many Spanish Jews came after the expulsion from Spain, came also to Poland and Lithuania, because the situation there was decent, was livable. But if you look at it in the perspective of history, like from 1680, 1690 onwards, until the Shoah, until the 1940s, it's almost straight downhill. It's downhill in terms of wealth and prosperity and opportunity. It's downhill in terms of anti-Semitism. It's downhill in terms within the Jewish community. The Jewish community becomes fractured. As bad as Lithuania was, Lithuania at least had a live and let live policy amongst Jews. The rabbis and the maskilim didn't agree, but it was not, nobody put glass on the floor of the bathhouse. But in Poland, it was violent, the disagreement. And because of that, the entire structure of Polish Jewry suffered greatly. What caused that? Why is the 1700s? Well, there are a number of things. First of all, there are outside forces. The Jewish people, even though we wish it were this way, the Jewish people don't live in a vacuum. We live in a world. There are other countries. There are other forces. There are other things that happen. And what happens affects us. And even though, Ben-Gurion's famous statement is we don't care what the nations of the world say, we only care what we do, that's bravado. That's just puffing it. That's not true. We see that regarding the state of Israel. We don't have freedom of doing what we want to do because there's an international community that limits us. Well, what happens in Poland is that the kings lose their sovereignty. And Poland becomes absorbed into Austria, into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to the Habsburgs. Krakow especially, Galicia was annexed by Poland, from Poland into Austria. And the Austrians were not nearly as nice to the Jews as the Polish kings had been. And Austria treated Poland generally as a fiefdom. They didn't treat them as being equal parts of the empire. So if they treated the non-Jews in that fashion, they treated the Jews doubly so. So you have now greater taxes, you have a lessening of opportunities, you have a smaller economic base, you have all of these outside factors, plus the fact that you have constant war. The 1700s is war all the time. It's Russia, it's Poland, it's Austria, Sweden gets mixed up in the middle. It's always going on. And it's hard to keep your community and hard to keep your head above water when all of these things are happening about you. So that's one important difference, is the fact that the outside situation changes. And Poland loses its independence for a period of about 6 years. Krakow was like an independent little duchy by itself, but then it was reabsorbed into Austria, and it never had a chance to grow again as an independent country until after the First World War, when Poland is given its independence. And that didn't last too long, and then it was conquered again by Russia and by Germany. And then after the Second World War, the Bolsheviks controlled it, really until the 1990s almost. So all of this affects the Jews, and it does not affect them positively. The second thing that happens, and this is internal, is the rise of the Hasidic movement. Now, I don't want to, God forbid, be accused of being anti-Hasidic. However, if you look in history, the Hasidic movement was the greatest revolution within the Jewish world, maybe from the beginning of time. And because of that, it was very, very divisive. It undermined the Jewish establishment, and its main target were the rabbis, the authority of the rabbi. The authority of the rabbi was usurped by the Rebbe, whoever the Rebbe was, whichever brand of Chassidus the people followed. And that therefore the entire structure of medieval Jewish Europe, especially of Eastern Europe, based on a kehillah, on a kahal that ran everything, based on the Parnasim and the Gabayim who ran everything, based on the Rabbanim, based on the Bet Din, all of that was destroyed. And it was destroyed by the Hasidic movement. It is not a surprise, therefore, that, for instance, I want to read you that 1786, the rabbi of Krakow, Yitzchak Halevi, issues an edict. And I want to read it to you verbatim. Chalila, chalila, God forbid, God forbid. Chaticha de Yisura, it's a piece of Isur. It's a piece that's forbidden. To do what? Lishum Odom, that any Jew should read the Bichlach, the little books, the pamphlets that describe the miracles of the Baal Shem Tov, that describe the miracles of the Rebbes, that describe all of these Hasidic things. Shenimtsoyim bahem dvorim zorim. There are strange things that are written there, he said, that are not part of Jewish tradition. Asher lo nitnu lichtov, that should never have been written. And kol shekein likros, and therefore should not certainly be read. V'chol mashmos divrayim, and what the result of these pamphlets, the Chassidic pamphlets, is lamayet limut hashas poskim, is to minimize the necessity to study Talmud, to study the poskim. You don't have to be a scholar anymore. You don't have to devote yourself to study. Va'abichlach shebechol mokom tuunim geniza, they should be buried and put away. Lo yero v'lo yimotzu. It's like bal yeroya, bal yimotze, b'chometz. They shouldn't be seen, they shouldn't be found anywhere. Well, naturally, this great statement had no effect on anyone, because Chassidus swept the board in Poland, and it swept the board in Krakow. And the reason for that was that Chassidus offered an answer that the rabbis did not have an answer. It afforded a solution. It gave a view of life, because the rabbis had no answer to Austria, and the rabbis had no answer to a deteriorating economic situation, and the rabbis had no answer to why the Messiah had not come yet, and they had no answer to what the future of the Jewish people is going to be. And Chassidus came along and provided an answer. It built an imaginary world. It built a world that was outside all of these problems. And if you went to a holy Rebbe and he gave you a bracha, so then you went home happy. Whereas the rabbi could say, I can't do anything for you. There's a famous joke, there are a lot of jokes about brachas, but there's a famous joke that a Jewish farmer came once to a Rebbe, and he said to him, Rebbe, all my chickens are dying. What should I do? So the Rebbe said to him, feed them rice. So he fed them rice. He comes back a month later, he says, Rebbe, the chickens are still dying. So the Rebbe thinks, and he says, mix in milk with the rice. So he mixes in milk with the rice. He comes back a month later, he says, my chickens are still dying. So the Rebbe says to him, listen, I have a lot of good ideas. How many chickens do you have? So, but people, you didn't go to a veterinarian and ask, what should I do? My chickens are dying. You went to the Rebbe and you asked them. Now there's going to be a counter-revolution in Chassidus, especially in the Krakow neighborhood, to this type of giving brachas. And that will be Kotsk, that'll be Pshischa. I've discussed it in other lectures. They said, forget it, we don't give brachas. But that's not our business. And the Kotzker said, ruefully, he said, I have my head in heaven, and he comes and he wants me to get his cow should give more milk. And I'm not interested in his cow. But most of the Rebbes were interested in the people's cow. And therefore, there was an opportunity here that the Chassidus exploited to its benefit and undermined the rabbinate, and eventually the rabbinate was almost completely irrelevant to the Jews in Poland. because the Rebbes were the ones that controlled the Jewish people, not the Rabbonim and not the Kehilos. Another point that has to be made with Chassidus is that the Chassidus was a democratic revolution. It democratized Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Until then, you had the aristocratic class, the wealthy people, the scholars, who were maybe 1% or 2% of the entire population, and they ran the show. They decided the taxes, they decided the rules for instance, the rules that were formulated here were never put to a referendum. Nobody ever voted on it. Somebody told you that you can't wear. Why can't you wear? I wear what I want to wear. The Chassidus came and threw all of that out the window. The Chassidus said, nobody has a right to tell me. And therefore the power, the vested power of the Jewish councils, the vested power of the traditional power, even of the Bezdin, didn't count. Because if the Rebbe could say against the Bezdin, he could say against the court, he was extra legal. And therefore Chassidus had a wide popularity. I would say that Chassidus is the basis for the fact that the Jewish people in Eastern Europe found themselves easily radicalized with all sorts of utopian ideas, because Chassidus is by itself a utopian idea. And therefore they were open to all of these things. Now, aside from the influence of Chassidus in Krakow, as in Vilna, the Haskalah comes to Poland. Now, the Haskalah was not nearly as successful originally in Poland as it was in Lithuania. The Lithuanian Jews, because of their rejection of Chassidus, because of their rational bent, because many of the ideas of the Maskilim were really parallel to the ideas introduced by the Gaon of Vilna and later by the Musar movement. So therefore, Haskalah found a real sounding board amongst Lithuanian Jewry. And the yeshivas in Lithuanian Jewry were infiltrated by the Haskalah, by the Maskilim, to a great extent. And most of the great leftist leaders of the 19th century in Lithuania were ex-yeshiva boys. Were people who came from the yeshivas. And even in the United States, Sidney Hillman, from the CIO, who was the head of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, was a Slobodker Talmud. And more than that, in Lenin's Politburo, there were two members who had smicha from yeshivas. Because of the fact that somehow in the Lithuanian mind, in the yeshiva mind, in the rational world, the Haskalah struck chords. In Poland, the Haskalah had a much more difficult time. Much more difficult time. But eventually it came. And when it came to Krakow, it came to Galicia. And Galicia became the stronghold of Chassidus and the stronghold of Haskalah at one and the same time. And here you had a war. I mean, there is no other word to describe it. You had a war. The Maskilim ridiculed the Chassidim. They ridiculed the Rebbes. They pulled out all the stops. And they cooperated with the Austrian government in attempting to have Rebbes arrested. The famous case is the Rizhiner Rebbe that was arrested and then had to escape and came to Sadigur. And it was all violent. And by violent, I mean, fist fights, it was just the breakdown of the, and each side here is utopian in the sense that they know what's best for the Jewish people. And so the Maskilim were convinced that whatever they did was justified because they knew what was best. They're going to bring the Jewish people into the brave new world. They're going to modernize it. They're going to reform the educational system. They're going to create the new Jew. And therefore, it's permissible to do all these things. And the Chassidim replied in kind. And they didn't keep their hands in their pockets. And you see elements of this in Israel today. I mean, this has continued until today. That, for instance, the problem, what should the Haredi school system teach? So if you would take that problem in a vacuum, so then things can happen, people can decide. But you can't take it out of the vestige of history. And in the vestige of history, the Maskilim attempted to create an educational system that would eventually destroy Torah education. And they got the government to agree to it. And that it had to be fought. So therefore, in the memory bank of the Jewish religious world, that's stored away. So here comes a commission, and it tells us what we're supposed to teach in our schools. Who are they? Why should anybody tell us what we're going to teach in our schools? Especially if the people who are telling us are, so to speak, our enemies. Stand against us in our worldview, stand against us in what our goals and objectives are. And in my opinion, it's not understanding that, is that exactly you go about perhaps doing a good thing, but if you go about it in the wrong way, it's doomed. It's simply doomed. There'll be Hafganot, 500,000 people on Kikar Shabbos. It won't happen. Because you can't tell us what to do. We've been through that already. We were through it in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century. You can't tell us. And as long as you insist on telling us, as long as you insist that your commission is right and that 1,800 years of Jewish history are wrong, we have no intention of listening. So I would think that this would be obvious, but it's not obvious because of the fact that really this historical sense of what the problem is has never been discussed. And people look at it in a vacuum, right? There comes a commission and they say, well, you should have mathematics to this grade and science to that grade and language to that grade. Everything is correct. But your premise is wrong. Your premise is they're going to listen to you. That you're the first person that came up with this good idea. And people, especially in the religious world, have a long memory. The collective memory of the Jewish people forgets nothing. So that's a great thing, and it's also to our detriment that we never forget. And that's what happened here in Krakow in the 18th and 19th centuries. You had this enormous struggle. Since the Maskilim spoke Hebrew and then pushed Hebrew, so the religious community said, well, Hebrew is out. So it's the same community that in the 1600s said what? That it should be part of the curriculum and that you have to know all the Hebrew grammar and that we're going to have mathematics, we're going to have everything. And in the 1600s, we're going to have the curriculum of the 1600s is what the Dovrat Commission wants to happen today. But they didn't come to my lecture. What can I do, you know? Had they come, they would have, they would see it a little differently. But in the 1700s and in the 1800s, if you want the Hebrew, we don't want Hebrew. You want Tanakh, we don't want Tanakh. You're telling us we have to have mathematics, we're going to have anything, right? Nothing. They don't have to know 1 + 1. And this is the cockpit of the struggle. And when you combine that with the fact that the church now gains much greater influence because they don't have the Polish kings to contend with, and Poland is a 95% Roman Catholic country, and Roman Catholicism is the official state religion. So then you have a great deal of anti-Semitism loosed on the Jewish population. Now, when the great deal of anti-Semitism is loosed on the Jewish population, that raises the question, why? Not only why, what can we do to ameliorate anti-Semitism, which is the problem that's brought up today also to all of us, right? What can we do? So there are Jews that say there's nothing we can do. It's a non-Jewish problem, which may be correct, but it is non sequitur. It doesn't make you feel any better. Doesn't provide answers. So, but people came with answers. The Haskalah had an answer. If we're cultural, then anti-Semitism will diminish. The Zionism came with an answer. If we have our own country, anti-Semitism will disappear. But the 20th century has mocked all of the answers of the 18th and 19th century. And because all the solutions have proven useless in the face of what happened to the Jewish world in the 20th century, and it's obvious to all that the state of Israel is not the solution to anti-Semitism. So now you hear again what we heard then, that it's really our fault, that the state of Israel is the cause of anti-Semitism. And you have Jews who say, well, if there would be no state of Israel, God forbid, but there would be no state of Israel, then there wouldn't be any anti-Semitism in the world. So you see how it repeats itself. This whole syndrome of what happened to Polish Jewry. We have pictures, drawings of how Polish Jews dressed in the 17th century, this is before Hasidus. So the shtreimel is not a Hasidic invention. The fur hat. The fur hat was the hat of Jews, wealthy Jews, rabbinic Jews, on Shabbat and on Yom Tov, simply because of the fact that the fur hat was the hat of Polish nobility and the Polish aristocracy. In our world today, because of the prosperity that exists in the Jewish world, thank God, so every chassid has, a shtreimel. In Europe, 90% did not have a shtreimel because you couldn't afford it. Who could afford to buy an ermine fur hat? But that's the way they dressed. And Chassidus took on the dress of its time and it maintained it as Jewish dress. Whereas, for instance, in Lithuania, the religious Jews and the yeshiva students took on Western dress. Suits, ties, Western dress. In Poland, the religious Jews never adopted Western dress. If you adopted Western dress, then that was a sign already that something was wrong. And that's the way it is today in many circles in the traditional Jewish world, is that if the boy starts to dress differently, even though he's completely observant, but he starts to dress differently, so then that's a problem already. The traditional Jewish appearance in Poland was recognizable. Jews wore little caps with a small bill. The Chassidim kept that, so that today, for instance, until a boy is bar mitzvah, etc., they usually wear those little caps, and they're made of velvet. In Poland, they were not made of velvet. They were much coarser material. And the rabbis dressed regally. There was like a rabbinic uniform with long frocks, boots, usually with a cane as well. But the populace didn't dress that way. But Jewish dress was so important that when there were decrees passed against Jewish dress, and passed first by the Russian Tsar and then later even by the Austrian government, that Jews couldn't dress as just in this traditional fashion. So the Chidushei Arim originally said it was Yahareg Val Yavor, that Jews should allow themselves to be killed. We're not going to give in on the matter. I just want to show you the extent of the war. And then later he was forced by the government to publicly recant and to say that we should do what the government says. But all the Jews knew that when he said we should do what the government says, it meant that we should not do what the government says. Because Jews are always astute in reading between the lines and understanding the circumstances that were involved. So here, and the city of Krakow generally begins its decline because Warsaw becomes the main city in Poland, the main centers of Chassidus, even though Galicia is a central place of Chassidus, but the main centers move to Congress, Poland, Gur, other places. The Ukraine becomes increasingly Chassidic with great rebbes, the Apterov and others, and Krakow loses its preeminence in the Jewish world. And because it loses its preeminence in the Jewish world, and it loses much of its economy, and because of all of these problems, so then you have this terrible decline. Now today, Krakow is the jumping off place for all Jewish tours in Poland because of its proximity to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and because it is one of the few places in Eastern Europe that has some major Jewish buildings preserved intact. So the Ramah Shul is still there, but the large synagogues are gone. The large synagogues were all destroyed. The city was bombed by the Germans, and then the Russians, and it just disappeared. And but nevertheless, the cemetery in Krakow is a great tourist attraction because the Ramah is buried there, as are many of the other great Rabbonim, and Jews are into graves. It's a great tourist attraction, and therefore Krakow is really a beautiful medieval city. It's probably the prettiest city in Poland for certain. So therefore it remains a magnet for tourism and for Jewish tourism until today. But the main city in the 19th century will no longer be Krakow. The main city will be Warsaw. The urbanization of the Jews, moving from the rural villages and from the farms, they'll move to the city, especially to Warsaw. And Warsaw becomes a city of 350,000 Jews. It becomes a very large city. And then you have Łódź, which became a great manufacturing center, textile industry. So the entire fulcrum, the middle point of Polish Jewry shifts. And when people become urbanized, when people leave their homes, so then urbanization takes a toll on tradition, especially with young people. You're in a new situation, you're in a different society, the old rules don't apply anymore, there's nobody there to enforce it on you, and therefore you have this breakdown. So that by the 1930s, 70% of all Jewish children in Poland attended non-Jewish schools. Now, people have the fantastic idea that somehow in Eastern Europe, everybody was religious and everybody was good and fine, and it couldn't have been better, and that it all fell apart either in the United States of America or in the state of Israel, but it all fell apart now. The truth is that now it's much better than it was 100 years ago. And we don't appreciate the fact that it's better because we don't know what was, we have this fantasy of what was then. But the 19th century saw Polish Jewry begin to disintegrate. The Hasidic dynasties held together to the extent that they could. And the basis of religious life in Poland in the 19th century was purely the Hasidic dynasties. But from those Hasidic dynasties also came the socialists, the communists, the secularists, the Zionists. Everyone came out of there. The Bund, the Jewish labor union, because you had great strikes regarding the textile mills in Lodz, great disputes between labor and capital. Everything that characterized the problems of the 19th and the 20th century occurred to the Jews in Poland. And therefore we see Krakow receding from its preeminent position, from the greatness that it had at the time of Ramah, from the fact that it was the great city of the Jewish people. It receded into the background, and then unfortunately the Holocaust wiped it out completely. The great ghetto was in Krakow, and that was the shipping point, the transport point to Auschwitz, and where millions of Jews were destroyed. So our memories of Krakow, which could have been sweet and could have been ennobling because of what happened later, are really tragic and sad. And we don't enjoy Krakow as perhaps we could or should. Nevertheless, and I think that by looking back at the 18th century and seeing that somehow we survived, and that a lot of the negativism of the 18th century has been dissipated. There are a lot of fallen idols. It's been expensive. And that Torah has revived itself amongst large sections of the Jewish people, much more than anyone could have imagined. And the state of Israel has come into being, and that in spite of all the problems and divisions, look at the wonderful country that has been created. So the 18th century, with all of its problems, should make us feel good about the 21st century and all of its accomplishments. And only if you look at it, I think, in that type of historic perspective, if you see the whole picture, so then we can be appreciative and thankful for what the Lord has done for us and what we have done with our own efforts as well, and to look forward to a much more sanguine and just future for us and for all of mankind. I want to thank you all for coming tonight and for the other lectures, and that God willing we will have another lecture series probably before Pesach, and we'll let you know about it. And thanks again for coming, and have a healthy winter. There's the minyan for Myriv.